We're looking at the 5 pieces of historical evidence for the resurrection, using the mnemonic ALIVE to help us remember. The last video was a death by crucifixion, and today we are on L, which is ladies find the tomb empty. But before we get to that, we need to ask the question, was Jesus even buried? Maybe the authorities took down the body from the cross and just disposed of the corpse. And then the disciples find an empty tomb and claim there's been a miracle. Well, Old Testament law says this in Deuteronomy 21 verse 22. If a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day, for a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land. And so Jewish law required that a hanged criminal be buried. And it was to uphold this law that Joseph of Arimathea, one of the members of the Jewish ruling council, went and asked Pilate for the body. And along with Nicodemus, another member of the Sanhedrin, they took him and buried him. And we have multiple eyewitness accounts of the details of that burial, how they purchased a shroud, how they wrapped the body, the spices, the weight of the spices, all of this kind of information. And then Jesus was placed in Joseph's own family plot, a garden tomb, and a round stone was rolled down the incline to seal the tomb shut. And archaeological evidence from the time backs this up. There were 3 types of grave used in those days, and one of those was called an arca solea, and that was exactly the type of grave described in the gospel accounts, and was the type used by the wealthy to bury their family members. And so this matches the prophecy 700 odd years before in Isaiah 53, where it says, they made his grave with a rich man in his death. And so the ladies had watched all of this. The chief priests had then called for a Roman guard to seal the tomb and to set a watch on the tomb so that the body couldn't be stolen and that a claim be made that Jesus had risen from the dead. And so we've got all these details, including humiliating details, that this great leader, Jesus, was so poor that he didn't have his own tomb, that his disciples were so weak that they had nothing to do with his burial, and that it actually had to be one of the very members of the council that had agreed to crucify him who ended up burying him. So that's our first piece of evidence, but there's other things to consider as well. It's interesting to note that there's actually no description of the resurrection itself, because these are eyewitness accounts, and there was no eyewitness of the moment that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, if you were making this story up, you would include this amazing moment of resurrection where Jesus bursts forth from the grave, but we don't have any of that. We have just the ladies turning up to an empty tomb. Now, some of the later made-up Gospels called the Gnostic Gospels, which were a century or two afterwards, like the Gospel of Peter, they do have made-up versions of the moment of resurrection where a light shines out from the tomb, the stone is burst forth from the tomb, and Jesus emerges in all of his glory, so glorious that he is a colossus and his head reaches into the clouds. But you have nothing like that in the Gospels, just the plain facts of what the eyewitnesses saw. And so we come to those eyewitnesses, the women who first arrived at the tomb on that Easter Sunday morning. And so you turn to Mark chapter 16 and verse 1, it says, when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they may go and anoint him. And Luke's account says, it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women with them. And here we have a thing called the criteria of embarrassment, which is that in that day and age, in that society, women's testimony was considered almost worthless. And so both the Jewish and the Roman society felt that women were unfit witnesses. And so if you were going to fabricate an account of the resurrection of Jesus, the last people you would have as the first witnesses would be women, because their testimony was not deemed trustworthy. And Mary Magdalene, who is the key first witness among the women, would be considered even more unreliable because of her past history. So if you were designing an account to convince people of the time about the resurrection, you wouldn't substantiate it with the very type of witness that your audience would find most offensive. Also, it means that the gospel writers were not willing to change their account in order to make it more reasonable and more palatable to be believed by the audiences that they were trying to reach. And so again, that's a great plus point for the gospel narratives. And the eyewitness accounts are full of this criteria of embarrassment. The disciples didn't believe. They were filled with doubt and fear. They were shocked that the tomb was empty. They don't expect it to happen. When it has happened, they don't understand what's going on. When they see the risen Jesus, they don't recognize him. You see, all of this is extremely embarrassing to the disciples and portrays them in a very poor light. And if you were fabricating it, if they were making it up, they would say something like this: we turned up early on the Easter Sunday with our picnics in expectation of the resurrection. We saw Jesus emerge triumphant from the tomb. We believed instantly, and we bowed down and we worshipped him. But you get absolutely nothing like that, because it's filled with these embarrassing details of their failings and what they didn't do that they should have done, which again all adds to the reliability of the accounts. Now, what about the grave clothes that Jesus was buried in? If you look at John chapter 20 and verse 5, we have this account of John, then Peter, arriving at the tomb. And stooping to look in, John saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. And Peter turns up, and he saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. Now I ask you, if there were grave robbers who took the corpse, or if the disciples crept in and overcame the Roman guard and rolled back the stone and stole the body so that they could claim Jesus had been risen, would they have unwrapped the corpse? Imagine that, the level of wounds and the bleeding and how the bandages would be stuck to the blood, and they're unwrapping this corpse, and then they're going to take away this corpse, naked, gory, putrefying. It makes no sense at all, does it? They would have kept the body wrapped up if they were stealing it, and yet the grave cloths were found in the tomb, and the wrapping around the face was found folded, separate, neat and tidy. They wouldn't waste time doing that if they were trying to steal the body with the Romans after them. And so that doesn't match some of these theories that people come up with, that the disciples stole the body or what have you. What about the fact that maybe the women, when they arrived at the tomb, they were in such shock and their eyes were so full of tears because they were so sad that they mistakenly went to the wrong tomb and stumbled across some empty tomb and then started saying, Jesus is alive. Well, of course, the disciples knew where he was buried. Joseph and Nicodemus knew where he was buried. The chief priests, the Jewish authorities, and the Roman authorities knew where he was buried. So as soon as that news started spreading, if it had been a mistake, they would have just said, no, come along with us. Look, there's the tomb. It's still filled. There's the corpse. And the story would be over. You see, these gospel accounts contain all these different marks of authenticity. You have multiple independent eyewitness attestation. You have very early attestation. And you don't have any of these marks of fabrication that we talked about, kind of elaborating the story, making up facts, this criteria of embarrassment. But you also, when you read and compare the different gospel accounts together, you don't have any editing to try and harmonize the different accounts. Instead, the different eyewitnesses focus on different details, as you would expect. And so in Mark's gospel, it talks about, in chapter 16 and verse 1, a group of women entering the tomb and seeing that the body is not there. In John's eyewitness account, he's got the testimony of Mary Magdalene, and it focuses only on her. And so it says, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." And so these seem quite different. They've not been edited, they've not been harmonized. Some would say maybe there's contradictions. But if you look carefully, although there's these dissimilarities, notice how actually Mary's words subtly corroborate Mark's account in the tiny details. Mary says, "They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb." So she'd obviously gone in and seen that the body was not there. "And we do not know where they have laid him." So she, although it only talks about her, she mentions the fact that there was a group of multiple people who had gone to the tomb. And so this is the mark of true multiple eyewitness testimony. Differences, different emphases, and yet subtle corroboration in all the tiny details. And this is the kind of thing that historians and crime investigators look for in eyewitness testimony. And then just the final couple of things to point out is that even the opponents of Christianity acknowledged that the tomb was empty. And so in Matthew chapter 28 and verse 11, you have the kind of counter story, the rival story to explain why the tomb was empty. And it's all about the chief priests saying, let's say that the disciples came and stole the body, and yet the fact behind all of that is this is the opponents of Christianity coming up with a counter story to explain away the fact that the tomb is empty and that they have no body. And so even this opponent story agrees that the tomb is empty and there is no body or no corpse of Jesus. And no historical sources from the time say that Jesus was not buried or deny the fact that the tomb was empty. There's no sources saying that he was still in the tomb. In fact, all of these counter stories are just ways to try and explain away the fact that the tomb was empty and that there was no corpse. And so you have one account saying the gardener was so worried that pilgrims coming to the tomb would trample on his lettuces that he removed the body of Jesus. But you see, all these sources agree that the tomb was empty. And so that's our second piece of historical evidence, that ladies find the tomb empty. And if the tomb wasn't empty, well, when Christianity began in Jerusalem, in the very place where the tomb was, then of course the authorities and the opponents of Christianity would then just produce the corpse and kill Christianity once and for all before it had even begun. But that never happened because the tomb was empty.